As wheat prices soared, the rich splash the cash, while the poor can only eat dirt. New Delhi time on May 13, India, the world's second-largest wheat producer, announced an immediate ban on wheat exports to control rising commodity prices in the domestic market and ensure adequate domestic food supplies. The latest figures show that in less than a month alone, the number of countries worldwide imposing food export restrictions has risen to 35, bringing the number of interventions in the food trade to 53, 31 of which are restricting food exports, while 9 are explicitly restricting wheat exports. This is reminiscent of the 2008 food crisis, when restrictions on food exports from various countries pushed up the price of wheat by 30% in a short period of time. India, the world's second-largest wheat producer, has seen a significant increase in its wheat exports under the impact of the recent Russia-Ukraine conflict. According to Indian media reports, from March 2021 to March 2022, India's wheat exports totaled 7.85 million tons. In April 2022, India's wheat exports totaled 1.4 million tons, and the amount of wheat export agreements already signed in May reached approximately 1.5 million tons. This means that in less than 2 months, India's wheat exports are already close to 40% of last year's total exports. The surge in wheat exports apparently let the world's second-largest wheat producer feel the pressure. India's Directorate General of Foreign Trade said that the decision to make a temporary ban on wheat exports is based on 2 main considerations. One is India's high domestic inflation, food prices rose significantly. The second is the Russian-Ukrainian conflict led to a sharp rise in international food prices, threatening the food security of India and neighboring countries. The news that India has banned wheat exports has had a huge impact internationally. Associated Press data shows that global wheat prices have risen by more than 40% since the beginning of this year. Such a spike in food prices may have a knock-on effect on countries' food problems. Many countries will struggle to cope with this unexpected event. The world's poorest countries are often the big food importers. This is especially true in the Middle East and Africa. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization recently warned that the number of undernourished people worldwide could rise from 8 million to 13 million if food exports from Ukraine and Russia are blocked for a long time. India's entry into the ranks of food-ban countries would clearly serve as a serious demonstration and exacerbate the shocks in international food markets. Back in 2014, the State of Food Insecurity 2014 report released by the FAO stated that the number of hungry people in the world had reached 1.02 billion, the highest level ever. The organization also claimed that this did not include those suffering from vitamin deficiencies, undernutrition and other forms of malnutrition, and that the total number of people suffering from food insecurity could be close to 3 billion, about half of the world's population. With the Russia-Ukraine crisis compounded by the new epidemic, in April of recent years the UN World Food Programme announced that humanity may be facing the greatest food crisis since the Second World War. This is no alarmist statement, as only 14 years have passed since the last international food crisis. In response to the subprime crisis in 2008, many countries adopted monetary policies such as flooding to stimulate their economies. In order to alleviate high oil prices, European and American countries used large amounts of food to make fuel ethanol, resulting in a significant reduction in food stocks, and the World Food and Agriculture Organization released a report that global food reserves were at their lowest level in 25 years. The knock-on effect was a food shortage in the food market, with international food prices rising by 2 or 3 times in just 6 months. In the US, Walmart, Sam's Club and the nation's largest warehouse retailer, Goodwill, have even announced special measures to limit the amount of rice customers can buy from some varieties. In Africa, countries such as Morocco, Egypt, Benin, Senegal, Ethiopia and Zimbabwe have taken steps to stabilize food prices by reducing tariffs, increasing subsidies and expanding sources of imports, but with little success. In Latin America, food shortages were exacerbated by extreme weather, with Storm Nu in mid-November and Hurricanes Olga and Felix in September hitting Haiti, Dominica, Nicaragua and Cuba, causing severe mudslides, loss of life and damage to major food and cash crops. In Bolivia, La Niña caused severe flooding throughout the country. The worst crisis was in Haiti, where people went hungry and had to eat mud biscuits. 14 years on, the crisis is likely to be repeated. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, 50 countries in the world depend on Russia and Ukraine for more than 10% of their wheat imports, 20 of which are African countries, and, more damagingly, many countries also depend on fertilizer imports from Russia. Russia is the world's largest exporter of nitrogen fertilizer, the world's second largest exporter of potash and the third largest exporter of phosphate fertilizer. Russia's annual fertilizer production exceeds 50 million tons, accounting for 13% of global fertilizer production. Since the Russia-Ukraine conflict, fertilizer prices in the international market have soared. According to publicly available data from the British Commodity Institute, the prices of raw materials for fertilizers such as ammonia, nitrogen, nitrates, phosphates, potash and others have risen by a cumulative 30% so far this year, a rise that exceeds that of the 2008 food crisis. The worrying thing is that India is just the latest major international food producer to join in restricting food exports, and it is certainly not the last, with soaring fertilizer prices pushing up the cost of growing food and fertilizer shortages affecting agricultural yields, with a knock-on effect that keeps international food prices rising. Key agricultural producers such as Ukraine and Russia have decided to limit exports in order to prioritize domestic supplies. This has led to a further worsening of the global food crisis. International food price increases have now approached the rate of international oil price increases and are higher than other commodities, including non-ferrous metals. It is clear that the double whammy of the new crown epidemic and the Russian-Ukrainian conflict has severely disrupted global supply chains, increased global inflationary pressures and reduced our expectations for global economic growth, said WTO Director General Evira in a media interview. In the report, Evira points out that a potential food crisis is looming for countries with lower incomes. In low-income countries, food consumption accounts for a large part of total household expenditure. Reduced food supplies and higher prices mean that many people in low-income countries may not be able to feed themselves. We do not want to see this happen, says Evira. New strains of coronavirus mutations and supply chain problems are already disrupting the global economic recovery, and rising inflation and record debt will further limit countries' ability to meet new challenges. Many poor economies were struggling even before the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and soaring agricultural prices have further exacerbated the situation, leaving people in these countries and regions struggling. Yet while in developed countries, such as the United States, food spending accounts for about 17% of total consumer spending, in developing countries the proportion is much higher. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the proportion is as high as 40%. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, the food price index has hit 3 consecutive record highs this year, rising 12.6% in March compared to February and jumping 34% over the same period in 2021. The crisis is getting worse. It is clear that the food crisis is affecting the poor in particular, while the lack of impact on the lives of the rich is not evident. Now in its third year, since the beginning of 2020, the new crown epidemic that has swept the world can be said to have changed us and the world we live in forever. While we are still in the shadow of the new epidemic, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has created a new geopolitical challenge for the world. The US, Europe and Russia are reshaping the military, political and geostrategic landscape of Europe in a fierce manner, which in turn is affecting the reshaping of the global landscape, and the East-West Cold War seems to be on the verge of a comeback. Even more worryingly, the globalized political and economic order that has been in place for decades will be severely challenged. In this environment, the poor are living in misery and even eating dirt, while the rich are still able to live like money. This raises concerns about the food crisis and the survival of the poor.